And I'll proceed directly to my subject. The main issue that I will try to discuss is deglobalization, multipolarity, and the return of the theory of imperialism. Actually, what I'm trying to do here is to engage with the main question of this conference, which is if there can be a cooperative multipolarity nowadays in contemporary world. And I will argue that in a world economy dominated by capitalism, there is no such case. Irrespective of goodwill and other things, there is no such case because capitalism's fundamental, inherent political economic mechanism precludes that. And to proceed directly, I'll take the case of globalization. Globalization was a dominant, at least till 4, 5, even less years, a dominant notion, not only mainstream economics and mainstream social sciences, but also in radical versions. What globalization essentially argued that we live in a world without borders. Countries and national states have no importance whatsoever. Free markets, which are a perfect mechanism for allocating resources and for producing bigger output at lower cost, will reign everywhere. And of course, together with that, liberal democracy will be established everywhere. So this is the perfect world. It's a world of mutual benefit to everybody participating in this world. In a sense, what's this? A picture of cooperation, international cooperation. Everybody cooperates with everybody else, and the outcome is that all win, a win-win situation. That's the argument of globalization. The reality is completely different, of course. And it was different even before the massacres that we are living in these days in the Middle East and elsewhere. Even before, in the high time of globalization, this picture of a mutually beneficial international order was a myth. What I will actually argue that such mythical pictures of a beneficial international political economic environment exist in capitalism only when one imperialist power is so dominant that has obliged all the others to follow its rules. But this dominance, and we know this from history, is limited in time. The British Empire was dominant, it fell. Then came the US has problems today. So periods where this myth of a mutually cooperative and mutually beneficial economic environment exists are limited and are limited to the case that some imperialist power is so dominant that can oblige everybody else to succumb to its prerogatives. For this reason, I'll take on the issue of globalization. I'll argue that it is a truth-like myth. What argued the globalization thesis? It argued that at least from the end of the 20th century, several developments, the reasons that were proposed were several: technological, political, economic, have thrown aside national differences, the predominance of national economies and national states, and their conflicts, because national economies and national states necessarily, at least in capitalism, go together with conflicts. So all these have been pushed aside, and a new environment where how was that dismal figure, Gorbachev said once, we now have a universal, a global village. Everybody participates in the same village. We have no enemies and things like this. The reality was totally different. To proceed, the different theories that ascribe to the globalization thesis argued that either because of technological change, and they proposed mainly the information technologies, or for political reasons, or for a combination of them. The political reasons was the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the annus mirabile for the West around 1989, created this historical opportunity for a global village. And there was a radical version of the globalization thesis, arguing that capitalism has an inherent tendency to overcome national borders, national constraints and accumulation. And sometimes radical, even Marxist thinkers about globalization argued that Karl Marx has envisaged such development, particularly in the Communist Manifesto. I won't enter into this. I'll just state that it's totally wrong. There is no such thing in the Communist Manifesto, and of course nothing similar in the thinking and the writings of Karl Marx. The two necessary corollaries of this thesis was that first, national economies have finished, and also that national states' ability to implement economic policies have finished with them. These were supplemented with several political claims. First claim, spread of global democracy, meaning liberal democracy. Second, that capitalism has the inherent tendency to abhor, not to like wars. Business do not like wars. War drives away investment and investment opportunities and business. We know that this is an utterly wrong historical belief. We know very well, at least during capitalism's historical evolution, that wars are very profitable jobs. And capitalist accumulation thrives during wars. Of course, with changes, passing from a peace economy to a war economy and other things, but the capital accumulation does very well during wars. This thesis dominated academic but also political environment till when? Till the end of the 20th century. What came then, we know very well. In the beginning of the 21st century, there was a first increasing economic turbulence, and I'll argue that this is the main reason of the aggravation of conflicts, economic and political conflicts. And of course, this culminated in the 2007-2009, more accurately, global capitalist crisis. It is indisputable that around that period, so-called geopolitical conflicts, I will argue that imperialist conflicts, aggravated further, expanded, multiplied, and continue till today, taking in the beginning the form of economic wars, trade wars, currency wars, and following with wars as such, military wars. So today globalization is considered almost dead by even several of its most vociferous adherents. Now, this poses a problem, and I'll skip several parts of my presentation for reasons of brevity. This situation poses a problem for science in general, and particularly for radical versions of science, and especially for Marxism, as far at least as I am concerned. How do you explain, how do you understand and analyze the international political economic environment? I'll skip again this part about the empirical claims of globalization, just one word, just one point. The globalization thesis made two empirical arguments. The first, that globalization constitutes an unforeseen before epochal change, and second, that it is irreversible. We know nowadays that both are wrong, are faulty. First, because quite early it was shown that in economic and political terms, a previous globalization period, at least one, the so-called first globalization, existed at the end of the 19th century. So the first empirical argument that globalization is a novel thing, unforeseen before, is wrong. A globalization existed before. And of course, the second also empirical argument is faulty, because if the first globalization was reversed, why not the second? What actually we're witnessing nowadays. I'll skip this part, which refers to the literature, and especially the quantitative aspects, what variables do we consider. And I'll move directly to another issue, which is the different currents of economic thought, basically, that debate around the issue of globalization. The dominant theory behind globalization is mainstream economics. Neoclassical and Keynesian to a great extent. Neoclassical, of course, 100%. Keynesian, 80%. Now, on the contrary, Marxist political economy approaches and understands the international economy on the basis of the theory of imperialism. What's the main difference between them? For mainstream economics, the international economy, at least in the capitalist system, is based on free trade, and from free trade they extend it to the free mobility of capital and possibly labor. And they consider this situation as beneficial to all. The theoretical argument behind that is the beleaguered David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. It is a theory that we know has severe problems, both analytical, theoretical, and empirical. To put it very simply, it argues that if we have two countries, A and B, A is developed, B is less developed, and they produce two internationally exchanged products, Y and Z, and the developed country, A, is more efficient in producing both of them, it won't do this, but it will focus only in producing one of these two internationally exchanged goods, the one that produces more efficiently, more cheaply practically, and leave to the less developed economy to produce the other one. In this sense, there is no danger of bankruptcy, meaning one economy not to produce anything and to owe everything to the other. In the long run, it will get bankrupt. This is the theory of comparative advantage. There is an alternative. It was proposed by Adam Smith and Karl Marx. It's the theory of absolute advantage, and it's far more realistic when an economy, in this case, a developed economy, is more efficient in both these goods. It will produce both these two goods, and then it will live with nothing, the less developed economy. So the less developed economy would become indebted and in the long run bankrupt. I'll skip the rest about the problems with this view. It's a long debate in political economy. And I'll move directly to the theory of imperialism. The theory of imperialism is the main analytical framework, the main analytical toolbox through which Marxist political economy analyze how the international economy in capitalism works. And the main argument is that the international economy is not a competitive environment which leads to a win-win situation, but a battlefield with winners and losers. And the gains of the former are the losses of the latter. Here I'll skip this. It's the history of the evolution of the theory of imperialism, beginning from Hobson's monumental work, some non-Marxist versions of the theory of imperialism, like Schumpeter, but then mainly the Marxist tradition with Hilferding, Luxemburg, and especially Lenin. Now, here I'm trying to somehow codify the main argument of my talk. There are three alternative ways to theorize how capitalism's international system functions. The one is the orthodoxy, neoclassical economics, and the majority of Keynesians, arguing that it is a mutually beneficial affair, based on what? On the theory of comparative advantage. The second is heterodoxy. These are mainly post-Keynesian currents, which argue that because of wrong policy decisions, there is a deformation of the perfect operation of the markets, and for this reason, international economic relations are not mutually beneficial. But if there is wise state intervention by capitalist states, the problem would be solved. And the third is the Marxist theory of imperialism, which argues that there is no such case. It's not a deformation of the perfect operation of capitalist markets. To the contrary, the perfect operation of capitalist markets means war in the international economy, and this war is supplemented and supported with political means. And for this reason, there will be always winners and losers. So no win-win situation. I'll skip this part. I've already said the main points. And let me move to the end slowly of my talk. The Marxist theory of imperialism was at its heights during the 20th century till the 1990s. Once the globalization theory emerged, even within the radical aspects of social theory and of economics and political economy, the theory of imperialism was sidestepped. I have already argued that this was a wrong turn. And the current developments, particularly after the beginning of the 21st century, show that the Marxist theory of imperialism is always the more realistic and theoretically coherent way of understanding how a capitalist world economy works. So there was a return of the theory of imperialism. There were several problems. For example, we have a very problematic approach proposed by David Harvey about the so-called new imperialism. In my opinion, is a completely wrong turn in analyzing imperialism. It considers imperialism as a form of expropriation, violent expropriation, in the form of the conquistadores going to Latin America and enslaving people and grabbing gold and other resources and transporting them to Spain. This is pre-capitalist forms of international exploitation. The Marxist theory of exploitation is much more subtle and at the same time much more realistic. It argues first that imperialism is a form of international economic exploitation. That is, imperialism is not primarily a military and political affair, but it's primarily an economic affair. What does this mean? It means the following, that according at least to the Marxist analysis, that if within a capitalist economy we have the exploitation of labor by capital, within the capitalist international economy we have the exploitation of less developed economies by more developed capitalist economies. How this exploitation takes place? Through an economic mechanism, not through a political mechanism. The political mechanisms are supporting economic mechanisms. What's this form of international economic exploitation? Transfers of value, meaning transfers of wealth, economic wealth, from subordinate and less developed economies to dominant and more developed economies. How these international value transfers, this international economic exploitation works. It works in the case of international trade through the mechanism of absolute advantage, to which I referred before. In the case of portfolio investment, it's very easy. Portfolio investment is mainly international loans. International loans, the country that is the debtor repay the capital, the loan, but also with interest. So there is an obvious transfer of value in this case, and then there is also the case of FDIs, foreign direct investment. Also there is a transfer of value mechanism. And I'll end here because I think I have exhausted my time. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And yeah, I don't have any slides, but I want to thank Professor Biljana Bankovska for the invitation. I've been planning or wanting to come to Macedonia for 25 years, so it's about time. So my topic is the Greater Eurasia as a multipolar concept. So Greater Eurasia as a concept is supposed to capture Russia's ambitions to diversify its economic partnerships and connectivity for the purpose of advancing a multipolar international system. And this is quite new to a large extent for Russia, given that in the past 300 years, or at least since Peter the Great, Russia has mostly looked to the West for economic partnerships and modernization, perhaps with the exception of the period under Sergei Witte. But at least over the past few decades, we see from Gorbachev's common European home to Yeltsin and Putin's Greater Europe, the objective was to integrate with the West. At least this was the case until 2014, when in the West we toppled the government in Ukraine, which kind of signaled to the Russians that the country would be a front line rather than a bridge between East and West. And after this, I argue that Russia shifted more from Greater Europe to Greater Eurasia, in which it seeks to pursue economic connectivity with China, India, the Arab states, Iran, well, effectively all countries on this massive continent, including the Europeans. Now, this, of course, happened around the same time when China began to challenge the hegemonic system of the United States, that is, with its industrial policies, the Belt and Road Initiative, various development banks. So what we now see is effectively that the unipolar or hegemonic world order has come to an end, and the multipolar reality has already begun to assert itself. So the question is then, what will this multipolar system look like? What form will it take? Because historically, we have had the liberal international economic systems only under the hegemonic model, when there's a huge concentration of economic power in one state, such as under the British in the mid-19th century and the United States from the mid-20th century. And this has always then been based on the idea of dominating the main three pillars. First, the industries by dominating the main technologies, industries, controlling many of the natural resources. The second would be the physical connectivity, so you're both by sea and land, but mostly controlling the seas. And lastly, the financial aspect, which is controlling the main development banks, the national currency, etc. And under this situation, it's always in the interest of the hegemon to promote a liberal economic system, given that it then integrates the rest of the world economy under its administration and always then have an incentive to encourage trust. But we also seen when the hegemon declines, this tends to denigrate or degrade into a neo-mercantilist system in which the rules are set aside, and we also see some indications of that today. As soon as the comfortable dominant position is challenged, we see the United States effectively suspending a lot of these rules, which it helped to build, in which it seeks to break China, roll back its technological development, steal the sovereign funds of Russia, and well, effectively, break a lot of its own rules. So that begs the question, what will happen now? Will there be because we effectively have, well, two major options. One will be a neo-mercantilist rivalry in which economics are used for coercion, and the second is a more cooperative multipolarity. Now, I argue that that the current neo-mercantilist rivalry is to a large extent a symptom of a declining hegemon, but the assumption that we will continue in this path is based on the false assumption, I argue, that we're merely replacing an American hegemony with a Chinese, because in fact I see more indications that the Chinese are advocating for a very different system than the hegemonic model we had under the British and the Americans. So under the Greater Eurasia, therefore, arguing is really spearheading this multipolar international system. And to understand how I at least interpret it, it will look, I have tried to translate the political realism into political economy. That is, in political realism, we tend to recognize that stability and peace and cooperation exist when there's a balance of power and an interest in preserving the status quo. So if we translate into this to geoeconomics, I term the concept of a balance of dependence, in which states seek then to avoid excessive dependence on any one state or region to the extent that it undermines its political sovereignty. So typically when we deal with interdependence, it's treated through a very liberal lens. That is, we look at it as an absolute gain. Now I argue that mostly interdependence should be understood in relative gain. That is, look at the symmetry of interdependence. So, for example, we have the EU and Moldova. They are interdependent, but obviously one is much more dependent than the other. And that allows the more powerful actor to set the trade rules and also extract a lot of political concessions from the weaker part. In other words, when you have interdependence, you have gain some influence, you lose some autonomy, but if you can skew the symmetry of interdependence, you can maintain both your autonomy as well as gaining much influence. And that's why states can often try to manipulate the symmetry in order to either develop hegemony or to create a more balanced multipolar system. In Europe especially, if we want to see the system we try to build after the Cold War, of course building a Europe where the largest country in Europe doesn't belong, Russia, is quite challenging, and this also demands a very skewed symmetry. This is why it's been important that the Russians are dependent on the West for its technologies, its main industries, transportation corridors, the banks, currencies of the West, while the West does everything it can to avoid or roll back the dependence on, for example, Russian energy, and this way try to skew the symmetry as much as possible. But much like we recognize that the system gravitates back towards a balance of power, we also see that the system balances towards a balance of dependence, that is an equilibrium. When a state is too dependent on another actor, there's a tendency for that state then, or at least a systemic incentive to pursue more strategic autonomy within key industries, but also to diversify economic connectivity. And indeed, this is what we see now around the world. More and more states are pursuing a multi-vector foreign policy in which they seek to connect to as many of the major powers as, as possible. So if you, for example, look at Turkey, this is their main objective. We keep wondering which camp will they belong to. Will they subordinate themselves to American, Chinese, Russian? And the objective is, of course, to have ties with everyone, as this is the main tool to get the best possible economic arrangements, but also to be able to uphold political autonomy. So if Turkey would do the rest of what we're doing in Western Europe, which is to cut ourselves off from Russian energy, Chinese technology, and well, whatever comes to the whims of Washington, Turkey would be much less prosperous. It would be excessively dependent on the United States, and under these conditions, it would also then have a lot less political autonomy. And this is also the logic which we're now seeing shaping the relationship between many of the great powers. So for Russia, the main and most indispensable partner is obviously China. However, it also has to be recognized that China is much more powerful than China is much more powerful than Russia, and the objective then, if we would follow this idea that they're merely competing for hegemony, you would assume that the Russians would break ranks, try to contain China, and well, a lot of these fantasies which are dreamt up in Washington. But it's exactly because the countries are pursuing a multipolarity, not pursuing hegemony, that they're instead taking a soft balancing in which Russia pursues strategic autonomy or within key industries, be it creating a digital ecosystem of its own, but mainly to diversify. Because what we see is Russia seems to be has made itself comfortable with China remaining the leading economy as long as it doesn't dominate. That means to be able to dictate over Russian policies. This is also why, for example, the organizations, be it SCO or BRICS, are quite favorable. They bring in many large powers. China is still the leading economy, but it doesn't have the ability to dictate. And this is what is considered to be a very acceptable multipolar system for Russia, and more importantly, it's also acceptable to the Chinese. One of the reasons why the Chinese and the Russians haven't gone to war over Central Asia, as was popular to predict a decade ago, is that they simply accommodate each other's strategic interests. When Russia diversifies its economic connectivity, for example, the international north-south transportation corridor with Iran and India, China doesn't try to sabotage these relations in order to make sure that they only remained dependent on China. And in other words, this is very different from what Russia's used to, because in the West, when we deal with Ukraine, Georgia, Central Asia, Turkey, the main objective is always to decouple the region from Russia. So again, the hegemonic model of divide and rule. We also see that under this system, there's a mechanism for stability under a multipolar balance of dependence. This is quite different from the hegemonic system, which tends to incentivize economic coercion. So if you go back to the 90s, it's very ideal to put sanctions on other countries because these countries are given a dilemma. They can either bend to the will of Washington or they can be a lot less prosperous. given that there's no alternatives. As we see in the multipolar system, the economic coercion comes at a very high cost, and there's a mechanism that punishes this behavior, as we're now seeing. The more the West put sanctions, disrupt supply chains, then the more we see the rest of the world trying to learn to live without the West. So they're seeking other centers for technology, new transportation corridors, new currencies, new payment system, banks. And this is effectively the multipolarity that Greater Eurasia is looking to spearhead. And we see again, the focus on these main three pillars of economic connectivity. First, industries, where we see the main connecting different tech hubs, providing cooperation between for natural resources. We're seeing grain corridors, industrial cooperation. We're seeing also the diversification of physical connectivity with a lot of new bimodal transportation corridors, both by land and sea. And what's also getting a lot of attention, obviously, is the diversification of financial cooperation. So there's new development banks, digital national currencies, new payment systems, and commodity exchanges as well. So we're seeing this new multipolarity taking place, effectively based on diversification, in which if one central power attempts to display too much hegemonic intentions and dictate terms, the others will have an ability to balance by leaning a different direction. And and again, the reason why we see why countries like Russia has become so comfortable with China is exactly because China has been pushing for hegemony. Again, simply because it accepts this diversification of other countries to merely be the first among equals, as used to be popular to say. We also see within the ideas that the Chinese are pushing, for example, the Global Civilization Initiative. They're not claiming to represent any universal values, to represent other peoples. Instead, they're speaking more of plurality of civilizations, and in other words, respecting the sovereign boundaries of the different civilizations. Indeed, most countries around the world now seem to be pursuing this multi-vector foreign policy of diversifying their economic connectivity. The main exception, I would argue, would be Europe, which is failing to diversify. It seems that we're reacting very differently to this counter-hegemonic moment, as we're instead seeing these new challenges around the world, and our impulse is to seek protection under the US hegemony again, perhaps lack of political imagination, but anyways, accepting this idea that we have to cut ties from the Russians, Chinese, and other centers of power and commit ourselves to the United States. My point is that these efforts can only be temporary. If you fail to adjust to the current international distribution of power, the system effectively punishes you. And you see this now with Europe. It's becoming poor by cutting itself off from other centers of power. It's becoming excessively dependent on the United States, and overall, therefore, becoming less relevant. And the way for Europe to escape this effectively is to eventually adjust to the realities of the current multipolar international distribution of power. And that is by diversifying, by not cutting ourselves off from America, but also linking ourselves closer with China, Russia, and other centers of power. And on the last note, returning to the Russians, I think that this is also why the Greater Eurasia Initiative is so attractive to them, to have this multipolar format, simply because under the hegemonic system represented by the West, we've seen that they, through history now, have been relegated to the periphery of Europe, where they can either be contained or perpetually weakened. And this is not obviously considered a favorable system. And on the contrary to the 19th or 20th century, when there might have been some ambitions for hegemony in Eurasia, no one seriously today believes that they have either the intentions or the capabilities of asserting hegemony in Eurasia. Instead, Eurasianism today means something rather different, where Russia actually gains from not being the most dominant country. Given that other countries around Eurasia also want multipolarity, we see from India, before the conflict, also Japan, a lot of countries reaching out to Russia for economic connectivity to make sure that we have an actual balance of power and a balance of dependence. So for the West, I think this system should be very attractive to us, given that we've had this fear-mongering about Russians coming to get us for all these years pursuing hegemony, that we have Russia, which is quite comfortable by being one among equals in a greater Eurasia, where it's merely one pole of power, and the excesses or hegemonic ambitions are punished. So I think this is, instead of being rejected outright by the Europeans, this is a very appealing system, at least preferable to what we have now, in which we seek to advance hegemony, and Russia continues to be the main adversary or pole of power, which doesn't fit into this system. So yeah, that's my main comments. So yeah, you want to go next, or no?
Greetings to you all, and of course a big thank you to Biljana for inviting me to take modest part in this very serious conversation, and listen to all the brilliant analysis of the moment we are all sharing. I personally am very much affected by the particularly dramatic and complex moment that seems to exceed the current capacities of rational solutions in the form of a collective, decisive, big no, stop, above all to the wars that are occurring, but also to the many irrational aspects of the so-called polycrisis that we see expressed in ecological catastrophes, in the deterioration of democracy and the rise of the far right, in the social realm with the increasing and brutal inequalities. So I found in the title of the conference the word quest very inspiring, because it demands, as Jan Oberg would say, visions and a visionary thinking, but I also think it demands a great amount of reconsideration of our own analysis and understanding of the reality that is around us. So I would like just to make several points concerning the quest. For me, it means, among else, to find a way to effectively act when many human beings are living the unlivable, and as the Secretary General of UN said, enduring suffering that's beyond words. So the quest in this framework means actually responsibility above all for peace, but also for the powerless, exiled, dehumanized, and deprived human beings. When we talk about peace, the quest actually reveals to what extent the principles of liberty, freedom, and above all, fraternity, all axes of peace, are under severe acts. And this is even more cynical when we think about the lost opportunities, or at least the lost opportunity that the end of Cold War actually meant. That chapter, when it ended, opened the gate to cooperation, coexistence, peaceful coexistence, and constructive addressing of global challenges in the name of the common good. Instead of that, we have apocalyptical tendencies, brutality of violence, technical perfection of instruments of destruction. I was amazed how much people were unable to control themselves when they witnessed one of the last operations of the Israeli army in Lebanon involving TikTok's pagers. They were so impressed by the high-tech demonstrated, including, of course, the mechanisms for precise identification and the Iron Dome, that they almost for a moment forgot what the purpose of all this was. So at this moment, when liberty, freedom, and brotherhood stands to be reinvented and rediscovered, the struggle for peace, in spite of all the forms, I'm not negating that they exist, and acts of mediation, of petitioning, of marching, of demonstrating, the gestures and acts of the UN and the International Criminal Court, they are real, they are to be respected, but on the whole, the voice of peace remains hoarse. And that is one thing that I would advocate, that cooperative multilateralism means a loud, peaceful world. When we look at all the bloodshed that we're surrounded, we're inevitably reminded of many authors in the past, but even distant ones, as Sophocles, who in his drama Antigone spoke of careless bloodshed and declared that much is monstrous, but nothing more monstrous than man. I know that there is an extension of this sentence because, and on the other side of the coin, that there is nothing more brilliant than a man. But this is a moment where I think that the monstrous part is too visible and has extended its wings too far. So for me, then the defining of the multipolar world would include responding to monstrosity with brilliance and creativity. And following this little discussion on the quest, I want to also mention that is occurring amidst an impasse, as German sociologist Wolfgang Strick defined, an impasse created by an accumulation of contradictions of global neoliberal capitalism, aspiring to total subjugation of citizens, producing fragmentation in societies and eroding social protection of citizens, and at the same time, as I mentioned, also producing brutal inequalities. But also he stresses that this impasse means that capitalism in its development has canceled corrective mechanisms and transforming energies, due to which at this moment it can neither adjust nor survive. So we're at the moment where everything is indeterminate, meaning everything is possible. Adding to this that the development of new technologies, the digital world that has been erected, and the surveillance and control that it presupposes, it has also eroded human senses, eroded the capacities to recognize our own interest and act collectively. So when we watch the TV or the other apparatuses that we have at our disposal, we don't know what we're seeing. When we hear, we don't know what we're hearing, the truth or the construction of truth. And we're losing, in this sense, the ability to really recognize what is reality, to recognize our own interest. So in this sense, a whole new project of renaissance of the citizens, of the society as a community is instaured. And searching for the paths to enhance transformative energies, I would like to point to a few possible few possibilities, I wouldn't dare say paths and solutions, but possibilities that might be viable. Among all the shared insights that we hear and that have their merit, absolutely, I think still we are obliged to enhance our diagnostic capacity. Increasing our diagnostic capacity is a path to transcend the sinister pronunciation of Margaret Thatcher of the Tina trap, that there is no alternative. I take it not only as a trap, but as a threat. And therefore, I argue there are things that we still need to think through, insights that we have to synthesize from other disciplines, from physics, from archaeology, other cultures whose experiences we have to consider. In this project of enhancing our diagnostic capacity, I would like to point to the need of rereading our own history. And this comes a lot from the region where I am located, where we have often been accosted for living too much in history, that history is too present in our presence. But what actually I think is the problem is that we've never really understood the traumas that we went to, the missing healing processes that never occurred, and that we're sort of swaying between blaming ourselves and thinking of ourselves as inferior to other cultures, to the West, or blaming others for being so unfair and not recognizing that we're actually peoples with a special mission. And there is one problem that is particularly illustrative of this. You cannot talk about the colonial past of the Balkans, because that excludes you from Europe. Colonialism is something that is a non-European phenomenon. So if you want to talk about colonialism and structures and experiences that left a deep mark and that are part of the problems that we have encountered in our later developments, you are actually being accused of finding excuses for something that might be biologically determined in the guilt of someone externally, and instead of accepting that you have problems with yourself. We do. And there's a lot of responsibility that is very local and that is a product of bad choices and unrealistic aspirations. but there are structures that keep re-peripherizing this area that I think have their roots in, for instance, a colonial past. That's one just illustration what kind of a rereading of history is necessary. Rereading the past also can refer to the colonial past, but not only to the victims, but those who colonized. It is a bit ironic that more than a century has to pass before the colonizers utter an excuse me and I'm sorry, not to talk about any kind of economic compensation. So there are a lot of shadows that have gathered behind our backs that I think need rereading. The second thing comes from Gramsci. Our diagnostic capacities require that we work toward a precise reconnaissance of the really existing present. And that means focusing critically, deeply on the key issues that are surrounding us and that open the door to possibly more social justice and justice above all to the complexity and the possibility of the present. And thirdly, something that William Robinson has formulated, understanding the inner workings of the global system, but I would add, and its vulnerabilities, particularly the social and ecological consequences of global neoliberal capitalism, but not just interactions, but flows that erode autonomy, sovereignty, that produce dependency and hierarchy, and create new locations of power of oligarchic kind, corporate oligarchies, but that are not transparent, that are unapproachable and unaccountable. And this also requires dealing with the structures of power, the geometry of power, and the aspirations of the current hegemons to turn their position into a perpetual one. The history of cycles of rise and fall, of hegemons, of empires, is supposed to end with the United States because it is the perfect country, according to some of its advocates, to be an perpetual hegemon because of its liberalism, morality, and superiority of its institutions. So this discards the reign of double standard, the erosion of international law that are suspended by the hegemon who proclaims new ad hoc rules. Besides the enhancement of our diagnostic capacity, I think the revitalization of the idea of global society, global civil society, is also required. There are so many movements all over the world. Some of them have more than 1 million followers. They all, of course, deserve respect for their local dealings and actions, but the fragmentation of these movements, the insufficient linkings and alliances to counter the global system, its repressive aspects, is the problem. So I think global civil society requires extra effort to rethink how an effective networking is possible, a coalition in the making, and how it's possible to organize simultaneous global actions in order to demonstrate that there is the power and visibility of something that is called the global civil society. When I say this, I'm very aware how difficult a task I'm talking about, having in mind that, for instance, in 2003, 40 million people all over the world protested against the pending intervention in Iraq, and nothing happened. So how can we limit, disrupt, weaken the power structures if this is something we are facing? And the last but not the least, I would argue strongly that the new South, new Global South, the really existing Global South, which means I'm not idealizing it, I'm aware of its entanglements and problems, but the really existing Global South has to be taken seriously. And this is a movement that's aroused a lot of attention, a lot of criticism, and of course, a lot of celebration. The critique from the conservative side goes in the direction of simply dropping it as a political slogan, as something that is totally unacceptable as a serious concept, because it aspires to encompass more than 100 countries that are all dispersed, different, with diverse population, different cultures that have little in common. Or it's dismissed as something that is anti-Western and can only be taken in consideration within a diplomatic framework. The left, there are parts of the left that are also very critical of the New South, accusing it that it's actually just a maneuver for the national elites of southern countries to project their position within the existing neoliberal order, that it's not a project of radical social transformation, and it's not concerned really with the needs of the majority, but only with their own promotion. Those more affirmative, of course, underline that the Global South is not a geographical space or movement, it's a space of inhuman violence and dispossession wherever that occurs, and that it is an expression of perceived and enduring hierarchy, an attempt for a diverse set of nations to stand behind a common program and amplify their voice and agency against subordinate positions, and pooling their strength to force a rebalance of the global power. So it's not a grouping, a homogeneous, consistent entity, but rather an organizing principle to guide reimagining a more just international economic world order. This is something, for instance, that Stuart Patrick writes about. So at the end, I would conclude referring to some of the things that have been said here, that our quest has to have bold dreams, bold critical insight, and bold actions based on thinking and linking, in place of what Wolfgang Strick has expressed as the position of the citizens who are coping, shopping, and doping. Visions of bold actions are the center of the riddle, of the challenge, a dramatic need, the quest for serious imagination and dedication. Thus, the main challenges is how to create, connect effective locations of transformative energies, of power able to articulate an effective no to the irrational tide that is combining economic, technological, political, moral coercion, and eliminating existentially irrational alternatives. At this dramatic moment, the quest is the urgent elementary need to stop the carnage, the atrocities, and the bold act would be to decipher the vulnerabilities of the extreme power and link all the positive enhancing efforts into an alliance for life and brilliance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we start the slideshow? Okay, thank you. Well, after a long day, I'm not in the very favorable position to end today's presentations, but I'll do my best to keep you awake. We've just, the title of this panel basically suggests that we ought to discuss also some, possibilities to promote some kind of cooperative international relations so as to support the emergence of this multipolar global order. And I'm afraid I'm not going to have to say too much about that. I mean, I agree with my predecessor that it is really important to promote social movements and global civil society, and that is also true for Europe. And I would say that if not for the political system or the corporate elite, there is still quite a vivid and lively, also internationalist-oriented civil society in the European Union. But apart from that, the basic message I would like to convey to you this afternoon is that when it comes to the political system and the corporate elites, we are not going to see within the next couple of years something like the emergence of a constructive, cooperative, separate European pole in that multipolar world order. And that has to do with a number of things, but as I'm an economist, I'd like to start with what I see as the basic tendency of the European economy over the last 20 years, and that is an increasing, what I would call neo-mercantilist trajectory. So when you look at the late 90s and the early 2000s, we had the completion of the European single market, the Maastricht Treaty and all that. There was a lot of talk about Europe as a champion of the liberal international order, the so-called rules-based international order. Europe was adamantly embracing free trade and all that. But I would say that already stopped. There's really a cleavage here between the discourse, the rhetorics of European policymaking and what happened on the ground, if you want. And I would argue that at least since the mid-2000s, what we've been experiencing and observing is an increasing shift of the European economic model towards neo-mercantilism, towards a neo-mercantilist trajectory. And when you look at the graph here, which depicts net extra EU exports of goods and services, so if you want the trade surplus of the European Union, vice versa the rest of the world, what you see that is that this trade surplus increases from something like 1.5% at the turn of the millennium to something like 4 to 5% towards 2016, 2017. And if you plot a linear trend across that time series, what you see is a clearly increasing trade surplus. That has to do with some shifts in the European economic model that originate in the 1990s, but were then exacerbated during the mid-2000s, particularly from the mid-2000s onwards. And that has to do with the shift towards an economic policy agenda focused on competitiveness, on making the European economy the most competitive economy in the in the world, as the Lisbon Agenda of 2000 formulated it. And it was complemented by a macroeconomic policy regime that was based on restrictive monetary policies as well as fiscal austerity. And with the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, the fiscal austerity became the standard response of the European policymaking community, particularly during the so-called Eurozone crisis. And you all know the austerity policies implemented by the Troika, particularly in the countries of the European South. And that basically made the economic policy paradigm of the core, the European core, with Germany at its top, the dominant economic policy paradigm in the European economy. And that's a paradox. You know, the single market with 450 million people, high purchasing power, should be a market, and this market should be based on an economic model that accepts at least limited trade deficits, and not a trade surplus, because a trade surplus for such a large market basically means a zero-sum game towards the global economy. So what the European Union gains in terms of trade surpluses, others have to accept as trade losses. That leads to, sooner or later, that needs to lead to certain rivalries, and also, you know, economic problems for many other countries in the global economy. So that model was firmly introduced during the Eurozone crisis. There was, I would say, a window of opportunity to change that model during the last 5 years, from 2019 to 2024. We've seen a set of new reforms, the European Green Deal, with large, or at least substantial public investment in the green transformation. We've seen the Next Generation EU program with an 800 billion euro program of public investment in response to the corona pandemic. We've seen certain progress with respect to the social acquis and the environmental agenda. But my argument is that this exceptional period where the Stability and Growth Pact, that means fiscal austerity, was suspended, the competition, the very tight competition regime was suspended, that kind of exceptional period has now come to an end. So what we are now discussing with in terms of the new European Commission is a return to an economic model that prioritizes, again, competitiveness. Look at the Draghi report that was published a couple of weeks ago, which reintroduces a somewhat modified, but nevertheless in its core, supply side, conventional supply side approach to European competitiveness based on liberalization and deregulation, not on public investment. And there are all kinds of programs and strategic documents by the new European Commission that basically argue Europe has a problem in terms of its insertion into the global economy. There are all kinds of dependencies and weaknesses. So we see a shift to a geopolitical trajectory based on what I would call new dependencies. I mean, some of these dependencies were there. They're not new. But the perception that these dependencies are a problem, that is new. And that leads to all kinds of contradictory policies right now. So, for instance, when we talk about our dependence on gas from Russia, our geopolitical decision to delink from Russian gas basically creates new dependencies. It makes us dependent on quite expensive sources of natural gas from Qatar or from the United States in particular. When we talk about our dependence on critical raw materials from China, the reaction now is that we need to de-risk from that dependency by building up our own supply chains in critical raw materials or green tech. Two problems with that. First, if we do that, the green transformation in Europe will not happen within the envisioned time period by the European Green Deal. And second, all that we've been doing so far, I would argue, is not going to remedy the situation to any sufficient extent. So the point here is the shift to the securitization of economic relations, to this new geopolitical paradigm, leads to all kinds of new contradictions and trade-offs in European policymaking, where the responses that are put forward by European policymakers are contradictory themselves and typically not able to really tackle the underlying problem. And that, nonetheless, the European political elite, I would argue, by reinstating this neo-mercantilist trajectory of an export-led growth model, is reacting not only to, if you want, political or international factors, it's also reacting to the pressure from the corporate sector in the European Union, which increasingly sees itself as not being able to withstand international competition and thus is very proactively lobbying for state support and protection. And that is also one of the underlying reasons why the new European Commission, the second von der Leyen Commission, now has shifted from what I would call a moderate progressive program in the period 2019 to 24 to a new paradigm that is based on economic security. And this new security paradigm is basically trying to build up hard power, to use that term, given that now the traditional dependence of the European Union on soft power, given its single market, the Brussels effect and all that, is considered a weakness. So now there's this shift to what the European Commission calls economic security, and that has multiple dimensions. It relates to foreign economic policy, it relates to all kinds of other economic policy fields with the new competitiveness agenda. It relates particularly also to the build-up of European defense capabilities, common European spending on defense and armament, etc., etc. And also it relates to the border security and return migration agenda. So everything else that in the last 5 years was high on the agenda of European policy making, the social acquis, the Green New Deal, etc., is now relegated to second place. So we have first to come to grips with the security challenges and the competitiveness challenges, and everything else comes second. So just to wrap up, what kind of trajectory will this lead to? How will European policy look like in the next 5 years? And my take on that is that the quest of the European Commission, which itself calls a geopolitical commission, to establish the European Union as a hard power in international relations, will run against its own limits. And these limits have to do with political limits of the European architecture. It will also have to do with economic realities. So I would argue that there is a lack of political will for further integration at the European Union level, given national preferences and conflicts of interest, particularly in those areas that relate to security and defense. There is, much talk about building up of European defense capabilities, but the question is, where's the money to come from? There is no talk about increasing the European budget. There is no political will to establish something like, a common safe asset as an instrument for the European Union to raise debt. That was only the exceptional case during the Corona pandemic and the Recovery and Resilience Fund. So there is no means for the European level to raise its own debt and finance investment with that. And there is, if you want, the subordinated position of the European Union vis-a-vis the United States, given this lack of common foreign and security policy. And there is this influence of the United States on Europe in terms of not only defense and defense policy, but also in terms of the larger political agenda of the European Union, that's probably not going to subside in the next couple of years. So I would argue the most likely outcome is that we will see a consolidation of power for the hard-right political forces in the European Union. There might be, this protective wall. There's lots of talks about the protective wall of the liberal political forces against the hard right. We'll probably see that this wall will come under pressure, and there might be alliances between conservative and liberal parties with the hard right. We'll see an increasing political crisis dynamics, stronger cleavages between member states, given that the neo-mercantilist model and its radicalization will also weaken regional cohesion in the European Union. We'll see a stagnation of the green agenda, the European Green Deal, green industrial policy. Instead, there will be this focus on deregulation, liberalization, plus cuts on social welfare spending. Any increase on defense spending will come at the cost of social spending. Given the tight fiscal framework, that's the only logical possibility. With respect to the international reputation and standing of the European Union, it's quite clear that also given its position with respect to current international conflicts, the reputation of the European Union will suffer further. And lastly, I would also say that what we've seen over the last 25 years, essentially, but probably what will also become even more visible, is the marginalization of left-wing political forces and social forces in the European Union. So I'm sorry to come up with that kind of somber message. I think that multipolarity will further emerge. The European Union probably will stay at the sidelines of this movement, and we can only hope that time will, come to the rescue so that European policymakers will change course in the future. Thank you.